The Bible is full of images expressing themes that run right through the whole narrative. We need to examine each of these images closely. We need to see how they all connect us to the larger story. We need to read the images. When I was young, I didn't know the city of London, the capital of my country, very well. I made the odd visit now and again, and even in my 20s, all I basically did was go to visit a library or possibly to one particular theatre, and we would go in and go by train and come out in a railway station, then get the underground to where we were going, and then afterwards get the underground back. So I didn't really have a sense of how London worked as a city. And that was a little frustrating. I like to know where I am. But when eventually we moved to London to live there, a long time when I was in my 50s, then I took real delight in being able to walk around London and explore its different streets and see how all the different bits joined up. And oh, if you go down there, that links in with that, and that then moves to there. Now, I suspect that for many Christians who value the Bible because they are taught rightly that it is God's word to us, it's the book by which we are to order our lives and so on, but that for many Christians it's like I used to be with London. They know this little bit there and that bit there and maybe a whole chapter there and a verse or two over here, but they don't really see how the whole thing joins up. But the glory of the Bible is that it does all join up. Jesus constantly was hinting and sometimes explicitly explaining how it all joined up. Paul's writings and the other letters assume that the Bible joins up and that it all rushes together with Jesus. So in this mini-series, we're going to explore some of the themes which run through the Bible in that way and join it up so that we can see the whole city and not just little bits here and there. And the first of these images is the image itself, the image of God in creation, which, as we know from Genesis chapter 1, is what God made humans to be. God said, "Let us make humankind in our image according to our likeness." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply." That's Genesis 1, verses 26 through 28. What is this image? In the early church, many theologians puzzled about this because the question of what is a human being was a regular philosophical talking point, and they wanted to know, does the image mean that there's a bit of me which is just like God? Is it my thought, my imagination, my memory, my will, or something like that? But that actually misses the point. Genesis is talking about God creating a world, a heaven plus earth reality, with an image at its heart. Now, anyone in the ancient world who knew about how the world worked would know that a heaven plus earth space with an image at its heart is a temple. A temple, a home for a God, a divinity. Only now it isn't just a building somewhere out there which may happen to represent God in some way. This is the whole creation, is to be God's home, heaven and earth joined together. And just as in a temple there would be an image to reveal to the worshippers who the God was and to convey the worship of the surrounding world to the God, so God puts into his heaven plus earth creation, his temple, his own desired home. He puts in an image, the image of himself, humans, male and female together, and he delegates to them responsibility for looking after the animals, the birds, and so on. That is then reflected in Psalm 8. It's interesting that in the Old Testament the word image doesn't occur that often, except when it's used for decrying the pagan carved images, where in pagan temples they had an image made of gold or silver or stone or some precious metal or even wood, and they were using that to represent their God. And so when the Bible talks about images, often it's saying, don't worship images like that. because, of course, the Israelites were told not to put an image into the tabernacle in the wilderness or the temple in Jerusalem, because only a living, breathing human being can genuinely reflect the true living God into the world. Dead, lifeless images reflect a dead God, a false God, a pseudo-God. But in God's good creation, humans have this role. Interestingly, in the ancient world, people did sometimes talk about one human in particular being the image of God, but that would be the king. Because, of course, if the king is all-powerful, then God is all-powerful, so the king is reflecting that all-powerful God into the world. But in Genesis, it's almost as though that image is democratized, and now we have all humans without respect of class or status, are called to be God reflectors into God's world. And so this business of reflecting God into the world, I think of it as being like an angled mirror which reflects God into the world and the world back to God. That's what humans are made for. And as we see the story of the Bible developing, even though it doesn't use the word image in this immediate context, we see Israel called to be the royal priesthood. The royal is reflecting God's sovereign rule and wisdom into the world, and the priestly bit is reflecting the praises of creation back to God. So that in the tabernacle and then in the temple, there are priests who, well, the high priest is allowed to go into the central shrine once a year on the Day of Atonement. The priest acts within the tabernacle and then within the temple. And then in Solomon's day and sometime thereafter, the kings have a role to play in the temple as well. But it's all to do with how the one true God wants to work in his world and how he wants appropriately creation as a whole to worship him. And so we find this theme of the royal priesthood then coming through to the New Testament. But by the time we get to the New Testament, there are all sorts of things going on in the wider world. So when I was studying ancient history, when I was an undergraduate here in Oxford, I used to go and visit one of the big museums near the college where I was studying and observe to my fascination the different statues of Roman emperors that they were displaying. And then I would look at the labels and see that this statue came from Spain and that one from Syria and this one from Egypt, and all around the Roman Empire didn't seem to be any, or certainly not many, from Rome itself. And I realized why, that the emperor, the Caesar of the day, would have an image of himself placed in the different provinces so that the local people would know who their ruler now was. The image was a way of projecting that rulership out into the wider world. And so God's image is designed to make him present, so that what the Caesars were doing is like a parody of the true image of God. And it happens on coins as well. The coins which the Caesars had minted and many other kings and rulers around the world would have the image of the Caesar on it. And the Caesar, by the time of Paul at least, was starting to be seen as divine in some parts of the empire, in order that the subjects, as they were spending money, would be in a way honouring Caesar. And in the same way, when Jesus talks about the coin which people show him, which is the tribute penny, and he says, whose is this image and superscription? And they say, well, it's Caesar's. And the superscription, by the way, because we know which coins it would have been, read that Caesar is now the Son of God and the true high priest, which is like amazing when you think of Jesus holding a coin saying that. And then Jesus says, so render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. In other words, you know perfectly well, you Jewish people who know your Bibles, that humans are made in God's image, and you owe God your whole self. There's much more in that saying, of course, but that's what we have to think about if we're thinking about how the image plays out in the time of Jesus and Paul. Jesus himself, of course, was anointed to be the true king, the true priest. And so he sums up in himself this role of royal priesthood, which means it's not surprising when Paul, in a couple of passages, refers to him as the image of God. Colossians 1:15, he is the image of the invisible God. In other words, he is both the truly human one and he is the one who embodies in himself the living presence of God. Because as Paul says 3 verses later, in him all the divine fullness was pleased to dwell. This is the real image, not like a carved piece of stone stuck out in some Roman province, but Jesus himself, alive, reflecting God the Father into the world and reflecting the worship and praise of the world back to the Father. And in the same way, Paul in 2 Corinthians 4 talks about Jesus as the image of God, through whom God's light shines into the world. He is the human image who reveals the Father. And this goes with the fact that, as we'll be thinking in another section, Jesus himself somehow embodies that which the temple in Jerusalem was there to embody, the place where and the means by which the God of Israel, the Creator, would be personally present. This is what bearing the image is all about. The result is that we human beings called to follow Jesus, transformed by his Spirit through the gospel, we are to be ourselves, as Paul says in Colossians 3, renewed in knowledge according to the image of the Creator. We are to be living versions of those statues spread around the world, only living statues now, demonstrating to the wider world who the true God is. No surprises then that in 1 Peter 2, Peter says, you are the royal priesthood. We now have the vocation to be and do in the wider world what Jesus did uniquely, drawing together the threads of the story of creation and of Israel, all the way back to Genesis and Exodus, and now displaying them before the world, so that the world may be summoned to worship the true God, and so that the sovereign wisdom and rule of the true God may be reflected out into the world. The Bible is full of images expressing themes that run right through the whole narrative. We need to examine each of these images closely. We need to see how they all connect us to the larger story. We need to read the images. When I first heard the Bible stories being read and people talking about them, and heard mention of the temple in Jerusalem, because I'd never been to Jerusalem or seen a map or diagram or whatever, I assumed that the temple was like a large church. I knew what churches looked like. They stood there on a city street and you'd go into them and there would be worship services and music and so on. The temple in Jerusalem wasn't like that. The temple in Jerusalem was a huge compound with the shrine at one point in that compound. And the temple was not just another large religious building, as though you might walk around Jerusalem and, oh, here's the temple. Actually, Jerusalem itself was a kind of extended temple. It was the holy city. It was basically a temple with a small community around it. And that's how temples in the ancient world worked. This was the whole point, that you would want to worship your God, whichever God that might be. And obviously for the Israelites, it's the Creator God, the God of Abraham, Yahweh. And so the temple becomes the focal point of the whole community, not just a bit of religion enshrined in one particular building. And the temple becomes, for all peoples in the ancient world, a place of sacrifice, a sense of having an obligation to the God, and so wanting to give God something which represents who you really are, a place of worship, a place of community definition. We are the people who worship in this temple, and so on. And that's true, as I say, for temples around the ancient world in general, and certainly for the people of Israel as they went to Jerusalem. But where does that idea come from in the traditions of Israel? Because, as we know, to begin with, Abraham and his family were nomads. They didn't have a city. They were wandering from place to place. But already in the stories of Abraham, we find that Abraham would build an altar to the Lord in a particular place and worship there. It's as though everywhere he went, he wanted to sanctify that place. He wanted to be able to show the God who had called him to leave his ancestral home and come to this new place. He wanted this to be the reality at the heart of his life. And so as we read the story of Genesis, moving towards the call of Abraham in Genesis 12, we find, as we saw in a previous section, creation itself seen as a temple, a heaven plus earth reality with an image at its heart, in this case, genuine human beings. The problem was that the humans failed in their task of reflecting God into the world and the world back to God. They tried to use bits of the world in order to aggrandize themselves, in order to get what they might want. So what was God going to do? Was he going to say, well, that's an end of that then? The story of Noah and the flood indicates that that was an option that God could have taken. But God is faithful to his creation. And so, despite human sin and failure and folly, God makes a way of demonstrating that judgment was indeed a possibility, but rescuing humans through and from that judgment. And indeed, the story of Noah's Ark, as scholars who have studied the ancient Near Eastern world have told us, is in a sense a temple story in itself. Here is this little ark, this little gift of God floating on the waters, carrying the people who are then going to restart the image-bearing vocation. And so we then get, after the Tower of Babel, which we'll come to in another section, we get the call of Abraham, and he goes about worshipping God from place to place. We get Isaac, his son. We get Jacob, Isaac's son. And then, astonishingly, when Jacob is running away from his brother Esau, having cheated him out of his birthright, suddenly there is another temple image, Jacob's ladder, joining heaven and earth, with angels going up and down on it. And in Jacob's dream, as he sees this ladder, God is making promises to him about the fact that he's going to come back to this land and worship him, the true God, in this place. And so these temple images point forwards, and anyone reading Genesis without knowing where the story was going might be puzzled by this. But it looks as though from the beginning, the call of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was the call to be people in whose midst God would come to dwell. How on earth was that going to be possible? Granted that they were a deeply dysfunctional family, as we see throughout Genesis, and indeed in various ways out beyond that. Well, God allowed them to be enslaved in Egypt, and then he rescued them. They needed to know that they were the people who were rescued by God. And then God took them to Mount Sinai and gave them the law, because they needed to be shaped and prepared. And the climax of the book of Exodus really reflects right back to the beginning of Genesis 1, because the climax of the book of Exodus is the construction of the tabernacle, which is a small working model of the new creation which God is going to make. The decoration of the tabernacle speaks of creation, and the function of the tabernacle is that there Israel is going to be gathered to worship God and strengthened to be his people in all sorts of ways. Of course, that too is shot through with mistakes and folly as Israel goes its own way. But the truth is that God himself comes to live in the midst of his people, in the tabernacle. And that is the primary biblical narrative, not about how we humans could get up to God, but about how the true God comes to dwell with us. It's fascinating as the story goes on because the people enter the promised land. God enables them to do that. God is with them. And the shrine, which is the tabernacle still as a portable tent, the shrine goes with them. And they have in the shrine, they have the Ark of the Covenant, the box containing the Ten Commandments and the other bits and pieces which symbolize God's agreement with his people. And early on in the book we call 1 Samuel, there's a terrible moment when they have forgotten completely who they're supposed to be as God's people, and the Philistines are attacking them. So somebody has the bright idea, let's get the Ark of the Covenant and take that down to battle, and then we'll win because our God will see us through. Well, you can't use God's living presence in that way. It's just an abuse. And so they lose the battle and the Philistines capture the ark. But fascinatingly, in terms of how God's presence works, even when that has been abused and misunderstood and treated just as a kind of cheap trick, it still carries power. And the Philistine gods and then the Philistine people have to bow before it. And eventually they send the ark back. And the ark arrives back eventually. And David then, when he becomes king, decides he wants to build a house, a fixed temple for the ark of God, a place that will replicate what was true of the tabernacle in the wilderness, only now be as a permanent location, which is both a good and a bad thing, as we see, because trying to keep God in one place is never entirely a good idea. But so David plans the temple, Solomon builds it. That's part of the ideology of the Israelite temple, is that it's the king who is the temple builder. But again, that can become something which people can misuse. Jeremiah in chapter 7 has to warn against people who are saying, oh, we've got the temple of the Lord, we've got the temple of the Lord. In other words, however we live, however we order our lives, whether we are worshipping God in holiness and truth, we're going to be okay because we've got the temple of the Lord. And the book of the prophet Jeremiah is how God is going to smash that temple and going to destroy it and going to allow the Babylonians to take it over and ruin it. And so the people go into exile. And the exile is one of the most formative moments 70 years plus, in the whole story of the Old Testament. And it's a puzzle. Where is God? What's happened to his promise to be with us in person? And so during the exile, various prophets promise that Yahweh will return and the temple will be rebuilt. Ezekiel has a glorious picture of the rebuilt temple and of God coming to dwell there, like in the tabernacle in the wilderness. Isaiah chapter 40 talks about the glory of the Lord being revealed at last, and all flesh shall see it together. But the fascinating thing is, throughout the long years following the return of some of the Judeans from the Babylonian exile, before the time of Jesus, nobody ever said that that had happened until at last, when Jesus came, Jesus did things, said things, lived in a certain way, taught certain truths, which led the eye up to the fact that he was the temple in person. He was, as Matthew says, the Emmanuel, God with us. So when he arrives in Jerusalem, the place simply isn't big enough for him and the temple together, and he denounces it because of the failure of the Judean people yet one more time to reflect the true God into the world. He says, if only you'd known the way of peace, which I've been announcing in my kingdom prophecy, but now you've rejected it, and so the temple is going to be destroyed, and alas, you with it. But then, as in the prophecies of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and Malachi, when Jesus comes to the temple and then does what he does there, and when he then launches his new temple movement, not least in the Last Supper, which again we'll come back to later on, Jesus' death and resurrection constitute his followers as the new temple, as the place where the living God is now going to dwell on earth. So that Paul can write in Ephesians chapter 2 that you are now the living temple because God dwells in your midst by his Holy Spirit. And so this theme of the church as the new temple isn't just a miscellaneous illustration, as many people have imagined. It harks back to that whole biblical theme. This was God's promise to dwell in the midst of his people so that his love and wisdom would be reflected out into the world. That is the call that we have in following Jesus and in being given the gift of his Spirit to do in and through us what the tabernacling presence of God had done in the wilderness and in Jerusalem. Now, of course, at the end of the book of Revelation, there is no temple in the new creation, the new heavens and the new earth, because God himself is there, and the Lamb, that is Jesus, is there, so that everything that the temple was in terms of a forward-looking signpost is now at last fulfilled. That's how this great biblical theme all fits together. The Bible is full of images expressing themes that run right through the whole narrative. We need to examine each of these images closely. We need to see how they all connect us to the larger story. We need to read the images. At the beginning of the book of Genesis, we find that tragedy enters the story very early on. Cain and Abel, the two sons of Adam and Eve, have an argument for whatever reason, and Cain kills his brother Abel and hides his body in the dirt. And Cain thereafter is forced to go away from Eden and from the land where he'd been. And Cain, nevertheless, has the instinct to create a community. He builds a city in Genesis 4. And the idea of Cain building a city, I think, is deeply ambiguous. It's as though he knows in his bones that we humans are supposed to be community builders. But the city is going to turn into a nightmare. And as the story goes forwards, we see that human communities grow and blossom and do all sorts of things. But in Genesis 11, it turns into the Tower of Babel, where the humans in their arrogance want to build a tower to get up to God. This is, as it were, Cain's type of a dream of human community gone to its logical extension. That Cain the murderer, Cain the one who wants things his own way, is then fulfilled in these people who, instead of going out into the world and bringing good news of whatever sort and fruitfulness to the rest of creation, they want to organize their world their way. They have one language, they want to keep it that way. The Tower of Babel symbolizes human arrogance. There's a lovely touch in the middle of Genesis 11 when it says, they built their tower going up, as though it was up to the heavens. And God comes down to inspect this little construction that they're building. And this is actually parallel to the movement that you get in Psalm 2 when the nations are raging and shouting against God. And God looks down and laughs at them and says, I know a better trick than that. And so God confuses and divides their tongues so that they can no longer proceed with their arrogant project. And then you get this amazing contrast. Instead of the Tower of Babel, which is a monument to human arrogance and to the desire that we, this family, this people, we will be in charge of our destiny, God then, in the next chapter, chapter 12, calls Abram, who later is called Abraham. Abram is a childless nomad. This is the symbol of grace, of the living God saying, I've got a better way of doing human community, and let me show you how that's going to work. That contrast persists all the way on through the whole Old Testament and still on into the New as well. And as the children of Israel become a nation, and when they're living in their promised land, they wrestle with the fact that they're a small nation surrounded by large and powerful nations. Egypt to the south, Syria to the north, Babylon to the northeast. And there are certain points where Babylon comes into the story, Babylon being the same as Babel, Babylon. And so in Isaiah 13 and 14, we see the prophet denouncing Babylon because it is absolutely like the Tower of Babel. It's arrogant, it's demonic, it's satanic. It's trying to replace God the Creator with a different force, a different power, which all consists in human arrogance, human violence, human wickedness of every sort. And then one of the most extraordinary tragic moments in that story is in Isaiah chapter 39, when King Hezekiah, having been rescued from an apparently fatal illness, Hezekiah then has a visit from the king of Babylon, or rather from his representatives. Hezekiah is so pleased that this great king, Hezekiah had been afraid of Assyria, but now here's Babylon. They're further away, they're the other side of Assyria. Maybe they'll be friendly. So Hezekiah is delighted with the messengers from Babylon, and he shows them all his royal house, all his treasure. And the prophet Isaiah comes to him, and he says basically, if you will not have the promises of God, you will have Babylon, because actually Babylon is where it's all going to go. One day, after your time, okay, but one day, the king of Babylon is going to send his army, and all the treasures of your house and of the temple of the Lord will be taken away to Babylon. That's one of the most shocking moments in the whole story that resonates through to us today. If we will not have the promises of God, then we will have Babylon. If we will not live by trust that God is going to look after us, then we are in fact buying into that system of human arrogance which creates a Babel every time and every place that it can. And so the heart of the Old Testament story is the tragedy of the Judean people being taken into exile in Babylon. By the waters of Babylon we sat down and wept, says Psalm 137, when we remembered Zion. And the people who'd taken us captive used to mock us and say, well, can't you sing a song for us? We've heard that you've had wonderful music in your temple in Jerusalem. Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing Yahweh's song in a strange land? And remembering Jerusalem, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. Jerusalem is where I belong, not Babylon. And that contrast of Babylon as a place of human arrogance and wickedness and violence, and the arrogance of human empire contrasts with Jerusalem as a place of joy and peace, as it was supposed to be, as a place where people could go and know that they were free because God had set them free from all that had enslaved them. And so you then get the book of Lamentations, the Lamentations of Jeremiah, lamenting the appalling situation of Jerusalem being destroyed and of Babylon coming in. Babylon is a parody of the reality. It's trying to get the world that God wants, but without paying due homage, allegiance to God the Creator, trying to get things for ourselves which can only come as God's gift. And so this echoes through into the New Testament, and that Babylon becomes a symbol in the New Testament, probably at the time a symbol of Rome. That wasn't difficult to make out because, after all, Rome was the great power of the day in the 1st century AD and for some centuries to come. And so the word Babylon could be used as a symbol for Rome. In 1 Peter 5, Peter talks about, cryptically, about the church that is in Babylon, meaning, of course, the people who are in Rome. And Babylon is a symbol which is larger than Rome. It's vital for understanding how human community goes bad. We see this particularly in Revelation 17 and 18, where Babylon symbolizes centripetal greed. We're going to grab everything we can, all the goods and all the fine linen and all the gold and silver and all the slaves and everything else that's out there in the world. We want it all here in Rome. It all really belongs to us. That is Babylonian, that is Babel-like, rather than the New Jerusalem, where the gates are open day and night. And yes, the kings of the earth bring their treasures into it, but it's a place of joy and peace, a place from which good news will go out, so that the trees which grow by the river of the water of life in Revelation 21 and 22, the leaves of the tree will be for the healing of the nations. That's the opposite of the Babylonian vision. So we find in the New Testament this kind of implicit Christian critique of all human arrogance, the human arrogance that builds systems, that builds actual buildings, and that builds political and social structures in order to make sure that it's all right, that it has everything it wants, and who cares about anybody else. And as we today navigate our way through God's world, it's important to recognize this tendency and to see it particularly when people say, well, there is this thing called religion or this thing called spirituality. That's off to one side. We're going to do society and make a country or a culture without reference to that. That is the Babel-like impulse, which is the parody of the reality. The reality is a godly structure which allows for human freedom, which enables people to blossom and flourish as the image bearers that they were meant to be. Life is God's gift, and Jerusalem symbolizes that. Babel symbolizes the arrogance of human empire. But it's difficult. We can't simply see anything that looks vaguely imperial and demonize it and say, there's nothing there for us. But beware of ignoring the Babylonian temptation, especially allowing a state to go its own way, whatever sort of a state it is. So we have in the New Testament implicitly a Christian critique of what happens when humans try to grab power for themselves and make their own world in their own ways, including if they either ignore Christianity and say, well, that's over on the side somewhere, it's nothing to do with us, or if they try to co-opt it and say, we'll have a little bit of Christianity and that'll help our state go even better. These are difficult issues, but we gain nothing by pretending they're not there. We need to remind ourselves of that great story in Genesis 11 and 12 and of how it worked out with exile and restoration. And we need to pray for wisdom that the cities that we build, the literal cities and the metaphorical cities, will be modeled on the coming Jerusalem, which is to be a place of peace, a place of hope, a place of life rather than a place of death. Please feel free to click the link to watch the next video in this sequence. The Bible is full of images expressing themes that run right through the whole narrative. We need to examine each of these images closely. We need to see how they all connect us to the larger story. We need to read the images. For most Western Christians, for the last few hundred years at least, the idea of death, bodily death, has been seen simply as the stepping stone into heaven or wherever it is we go after death, without any thought for what happens actually, according to the New Testament, in God's creation of new heavens and new earth. And so for many Christians, death has been seen as just a gateway into new life. And so it's not anything to worry about from that point of view, and we shouldn't be grieving over people who've died. So some people have taught. I remember going to funerals when I was a boy, and people who were being quite careful not to cry, not to weep, because whoever it was that had died had gone to a much better place. Well, the whole question of grief over death is something we may return to, but we have to remind ourselves that in the New Testament, death is the enemy. It is the last enemy, according to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, but it is not a kind, gentle friend ready to usher us into the presence of God. It is the negation of all that is good in creation. It is the moment of chaos, of dissolution, of God saying we cannot allow the corruption that has been introduced into the world through sin and folly. We cannot allow that to have free room to go on. God will not forever endorse the people that we have made ourselves into. Paul says in Romans 8, the body is dead because of sin. Then he does say the spirit is life because of righteousness, but how that works out is a whole other story to which we will return. The point is this: we have so easily imagined that it's just death and then heaven, and then we've forgotten that actually death is the destruction of the good creation, and that God's ultimate purpose is the reconstruction of heaven and earth and the resurrection to a new body which will be able to inhabit that new heavens and new earth. The original creation then has to be seen as good but transient. When God made the world, he made it very good, as Genesis says, but it was a project. It was going somewhere. And God put into his creation the symbols and signs of what it would take for humans to be his partners in that project. But if they were to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, God says, on the day that you do that, you will die. Now, people have said, but they did it and they didn't die that day, but that's simply a misunderstanding of the Hebrew idiom. On the day that you do it, it doesn't mean within the 24-hour period immediately following your eating. Rather, it means once you do that, then you have signed up to death, and that's what's going to happen. And so Genesis 5, which tells the story of Adam and Eve's descendants, has ringing like a great bell through that chapter. So-and-so did this, he lived so-and-so, and then he died, and he died, and he died. It's a way of saying God meant what he said, that there is no way of sliding round the edge of that curse of death. And death is a curse. It's the denial of the goodness of creation. And there are some, from time to time, we see in the Old Testament who try to say that they have made a covenant with death. There's a passage in the book of Isaiah, chapter 28, where Isaiah denounces the people who say they have made a covenant with death. With Sheol we have an agreement. This is Isaiah 28, verse 15. And when the overwhelming scourge passes through, it won't come to us. We have made lies our refuge, and in falsehood we have taken shelter. In other words, humans try to fool themselves and try to fool one another that they can do a deal, that actually death isn't going to matter, that as some people have said, death is nothing at all. There's a passage written by an old Anglican theologian from 100 years or more ago, which begins, death is nothing at all, I've just slipped into the next room. That is a lie. That's not what it's about. And actually the theologian in question went on in the next paragraph of the sermon to explain that that may be how it seems from time to time when someone you love has just died, but actually it is a terrible, a horrible thing, a matter of the rending of one's very heart. So death is the destruction of what is good. It's not just an easy passage. And the Old Testament does, however, have glimpses of a rescue from death, not a going to heaven, but rather in Psalm 16 there is a promise that God will not abandon us. He will not let us see corruption, a promise which remains in abeyance until many years later it is fulfilled in Jesus. And then the book of Acts picks that up and quotes Psalm 16 in relation to Jesus, who was raised from the dead, and then going on to the promise that one day all Jesus' people will be raised from the dead, not just going to heaven, which, interestingly, the New Testament does not hold out as the ultimate goal at all, but rather the new world in which death will have been defeated. That's the point of it all. So the little hints that you get in Hosea chapter 6, in Ezekiel 37, and then a bit more explicitly in Daniel chapter 12, one of the passages which the later rabbis loved to quote when they were talking about resurrection. These are hints that God will do something more. Not just, well, after death God will look after you, though he will, that's promised as well, but that eventually there will be a new creation and that death itself will be overcome. This is all based on the belief that God is the creator who has promised to put all things right. If you take away the idea of God as the good creator, then maybe this present world is a mess. It's just a fudge as thrown together by the forces of nature by themselves, and it may be a good thing if we escape it. Many people believe that today. Or if you think, well, yes, it was a good place, but it doesn't look as though anything good can now come out of it. In other words, God is not going to put it right. If you believe that, then again, no need for resurrection. Death may, it turns out, have the last word. But if God is the good creator, and if he is the judge who has promised to set everything right, then resurrection will follow. Death will be defeated. This, of course, bursts out in the New Testament in a whole new way. Jesus' announcement of God's kingdom coming on earth as in heaven, and Jesus pioneering the way of healing and hope throughout his short but powerful earthly career. These are ways of saying yes to life and no to death. So that even when Jesus weeps at the tomb of his friend, Lazarus, in John chapter 11, he weeps because death is cruel and nasty and mean. And Jesus can, even though Jesus knows that God the Father is going to overcome it in the case of Lazarus and then specifically in his own case, Jesus weeps because he sees the damage that death does to communities, to families, and so on. But out of all that, Jesus is announcing that something new is on the way. When one of Lazarus' sisters said to him, if only you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died, Jesus says, your brother will rise again. And she says, well, I know he will rise at the resurrection on the last day. And Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Resurrection has come to life and is standing here talking to you. And so this is a way of saying death does not have the last word. And so resurrection is a way of talking about God's undoing of the destruction which death has brought about. And that, therefore, is also to do with forgiveness. Death comes because humans rebel against God. Resurrection and forgiveness go hand in hand. They are God's way of saying, I will make all things new. I will put everything right. And so in the New Testament, we can see that the idea of death is made into something which we can experience already in baptism. In Romans 6, Paul talks about dying with the Messiah and already rising with him, so that if you are a baptized and believing Christian, then there is a sense in which you have already passed from death to life. It's a fascinating promise which Jesus himself echoes in John 5, verse 24. If you are part of the Messiah's family, you will not come into judgment. You've already passed from death to life. So that after death, there is life with the Messiah in the temporary state, and then the fullness of resurrection life eventually. So there is, of course, a subsense in which, as all pastors know, when you are with somebody who is deeply sick and for whom the only way forward is through bodily death sometimes appears as a kindly friend, putting somebody, as we say rather crudely, out of their misery. Yes, that can be how it is. I have sat at the bedside of people who have died for whom it was, as it were, a blessed relief, a kind of a sigh of relief. But in the larger scale, that's not what was going on. Death is not a kindly friend. Death is the last enemy. And new heavens and new earth is God's defeat of death. We must not make the mistake of those in Isaiah 28 who thought they could make a covenant with death and say, it's all right, really. No, death is to be defeated. We must not make peace with it. It has been defeated by Jesus on the cross and in his resurrection. It will be defeated in the last day when God makes new heavens and new earth. And we are called in the present already to be people of life. The Bible is full of images expressing themes that run right through the whole narrative. We need to examine each of these images closely. We need to see how they all connect us to the larger story. We need to read the images. If we read the Pentateuch as a whole, the Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, there is a particular transition between the second and the third books. At the end of Exodus, as we've seen in an earlier section, the tabernacle is constructed by the Israelites in the wilderness, and God himself comes to live in the midst of his people. Now, you make the transition then to the very next book, which is Leviticus. And Leviticus is a collection of laws to do with the tabernacle and how it's to be looked after and so on. And it functions as a kind of set of health and safety regulations. If you're going to have God living in the midst, you're going to have to know how to cope with that, because God is God. It's not just like some creature, some mythical being who might just hang out with you for a while and come and go. This is God, the living God, the creator, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And God in particular is holy. He is pure, and humans are full of corruption and sin and death. And in God's good creation, symbolized in the tabernacle, nothing to do with sin or death can be allowed on site. So therefore you need a mechanism by which constantly to purify the tabernacle itself and those who enter it and everything that goes on there, so that God's presence may dwell there. This stands on its head something which people have often thought when it comes to the question of the death of the animal in sacrifice and the use of the blood that is released from the dead animal. Because people have routinely thought that sinful beings, sinful humans, need to approach God, but they can't because of their sin. Therefore, God has to punish them so that they can approach God. And since that's going to be awkward if they are then killed, well, they kill animals instead, and the animals die, they do not, and so they can approach God. That gets it the wrong way round. The whole drama, the whole narrative is about God coming to dwell with his people, and that what has to happen for that to take place is for the people and the tabernacle itself to be cleansed. What is going to cleanse them? Well, the main answer is the blood of the sacrificial animals. Why? Because according to Leviticus 17, the blood has life in it, and the blood is God's gift of life, and life is more powerful than death. So life, symbolized by blood, washes away and cleanses all the taint of death, which carries with it all the taint of sin, so that then God's presence may remain with his people. That's the logic of the blood as the God-given carrier of life, and hence the effective symbol of life, and the blood being the cleansing agent which enables humans and the tabernacle to be the place where God can and will come and dwell with his people. This then makes real what was spoken of in Exodus 24, when Moses sprinkles the people with blood and says, this is the blood of the covenant that God is making with you. We'll talk a bit about covenants in a subsequent section. But the blood is a sign that God is cleansing these people so that they can be the people among whom God will come and live. God's own life is to become their life, and the blood is a symbol and sign of that. And it's referred referred to once or twice later on, both in the Old and the New Testaments, in Zechariah chapter 9, verse 11, and then in the letter to the Hebrews particularly. But the place which we naturally think of when we think of the gift of blood is the words of Jesus at the Last Supper, jumping straight forward into Matthew 26, when Jesus says, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." And when we hear language about eating Jesus' flesh and drinking his blood, John chapter 6, verses 53 to 56, Jesus says, "Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you can have no life in you." Now, that is extraordinary because the eating or drinking of blood was expressly forbidden in the Old Testament, precisely because it is the God-given gift of life. We see this in Genesis chapter 9, verses 4 to 6, where Noah and his family are forbidden to have anything to do with consuming blood because it is God's gift of life. It is sacred. And so it is shocking then when in John 6 Jesus speaks like that, and when at the Last Supper he invites his followers to eat his flesh in the form of the bread and drink his blood in the form of the wine. The only passage I know which helps me to explain that is in 2 Samuel chapter 23, verse 17. What happens, it's the author of the book is summarizing some significant things which some of David's closest allies and associates did in the early days when he was still wandering around in the wilderness. That one time David said to his men, "I wish someone would go and get me a drink of water from the well that's in Bethlehem." And 3 of his mighty men of valor, okay, we're up for this. They broke through the Philistine ranks. They went to Bethlehem. They got David a cup of water. They broke back through the Philistine ranks. They gave it to David. And David poured it out on the ground. He said, "Far be it from me to drink the blood of these men who went at the risk of their lives." In other words, David was refusing to profit from the life which potentially was laid down. They might easily have been caught and killed by the Philistines. And David expresses that in terms of drinking their blood if he was to drink that cup of water, even though he'd asked for it. I think that helps me understand what's going on when Jesus speaks about eating his flesh and particularly drinking his blood. This is his life, his purifying life laid down in death, but then to be accessible for all who believe in him, so that we can be purified from sin, so that we can be ultimately rescued from death itself in the new life, the new creation, in which the resurrection will give us the body which has gone through death and out the other side into new life. Jesus' life poured out in death is there to cleanse us, to revive us, to establish God's covenant with all who share that meal, with all who follow Jesus, with all who allow his life and death to heal us, to cleanse us, to rescue us. We'll think more in the next section about the fuller meaning of Jesus' death, but at its heart, this is one of the key elements, rooted all the way back there in Leviticus 17. The blood makes atonement, enables God to come and dwell with us because of the life which it symbolizes. Now, Jesus' life laid down in death, his literal shed blood, becomes the means of cleansing, renewing, healing and reviving, and giving us new life. The Bible is full of images expressing themes that run right through the whole narrative. We need to examine each of these images closely. We need to see how they all connect us to the larger story. We need to read the images. In the 1st century AD, crucifixion was a symbol. It was a sign of something. Everybody knew about crucifixion. Certainly they knew about it in Galilee and Judea, the land of Jesus' birth and home. Because around the time Jesus was born, there was a great Jewish revolt against Rome. They didn't want to pay Caesar taxes, not just because they didn't want to pay the money, they didn't want Caesar to be running their country. and Rome came and did what it was used to doing, which was to crucify people, crucified hundreds and hundreds of rebels all over. One other time, back in the days of the late Roman Republic, when there was a slave revolt, they crucified so many people that between two towns separated by many miles, there was another cross every 20 yards or so, all the way down the road, with a half-human, half-dead, half-alive, poor, beaten-up, bedraggled slave hanging there between life and death, between heaven and earth. That horrible, ghastly symbol was well known in the ancient world, especially in the Roman world, and not least to the Jewish people, as a sign which said, this is what brute empire does. This is what human arrogance does to anyone who gets in the way. And that was what the empire did to its rebel subjects. It was what masters routinely did to slaves. Crucifixion was often the death of the slave. One of the most extraordinary things about Christianity is that within 20 years of the death of Jesus, the symbol which had spoken so powerfully of the horrors of brutal imperial rule spoke even more powerfully of the rescuing love of the Creator God. Paul says, the Son of God loved me and gave himself for me. And Paul's theology of the cross is of a God who has come to the place where humans are doing the worst thing they can to one another, and instead of the terrible things that happen thus, is making it the way of new life. How on earth does that transition take place? The multiple meanings of the cross are sketched right across the New Testament, and the four Gospels, of course, have Jesus' crucifixion as their narrative climax. They're all leading the eye up to the point where Jesus is crucified, and indeed they're telling the story of his public career, echoing a lot of strands from the Old Testament in such a way as to have these themes rushing together so that the crucifixion means what it means within the longer narratives all the way from Genesis forwards, and particularly the prophets. But one of the central meanings which the cross has in the New Testament is the theme of victory. On the cross, when Jesus was crucified, they stuck up above his head the sign with the charge on which he was being condemned, and it said, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And the early church recognized that, and the Gospels record it as a sign that this is in fact the messianic victory, the time when Israel's Messiah really does win the victory over the pagan world. That was always going to be part of the job of the Messiah. Of course, it didn't look like that. As Jesus himself must have known as he went to the cross, it was failed messiahs who ended up on crosses, not successful ones. That's part of the irony, the drama of the whole event. But Jesus, as he anticipates it in John chapter 12, says these very significant words. There's been a moment when some Greeks who are there in Jerusalem for the festival come and want to see Jesus. And Jesus doesn't say, okay, I'll meet them. He says, actually, this is a sign that God's moment has come at last. And so Jesus is interpreting the fact that people from outside the chosen people are wanting to come and see him as a sign of the great transition, the time when God is going to do the new thing and bring in people from all over the world. But Jesus knows what this will mean for him himself. And so he says, John 12:27, now my heart is troubled. What am I going to say, Father? Save me from this moment? No, it was because of this that I came to this moment. Father, glorify your name. In other words, Jesus sees his forthcoming death as the means by which God the Father would be glorified, not shamed as you might imagine, but actually glorified. That as we probe further in John's Gospel, it is because the cross is the ultimate revelation of God's love, God's self-giving love in the death of his Son. But Jesus then explains, he says, now comes the judgment of this world, verse 31. Now this world's ruler is going to be thrown out. And when I've been lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself. In other words, something has to happen which will then enable the peoples of the wider world to come and become part of the people of the one true Creator God. What is that thing that has to happen? The answer is that the thing which presently holds them back, the idolatry of the pagan world, the sin of all humans, Jew and Gentile alike, the death which comes to all humans, Jew and Gentile alike, this idolatry, this sin, this death is going to be defeated. Jesus, in his death, is going to win the victory. How is that going to happen? It's going to happen through the new Passover. Jesus chose Passover, the feast of the Exodus, the time when Israel commemorated being rescued from Egypt, coming through the Red Sea, being taken by God to the Promised Land. Jesus chose Passover as the appropriate moment to go to Jerusalem, to do what had to be done, to confront the authorities with his message of the kingdom, knowing perfectly well what was going to happen in the purposes of God. How does this work, as people say? Well, it works because Jesus is there standing in the place of the sinner, in the place of the wicked. John chapter 18 at the end says, as Jesus is condemned to death, there's a robber, a brigand, Barabbas, and he goes free. The way John describes that makes it clear. Barabbas is the one who is guilty, but he goes free and Jesus dies. Luke does the same sort of thing actually several times in his description of the cross, but particularly when one of the brigands on the cross beside Jesus, because there are two crucified, one on either side of him, says, this man has done nothing wrong, but we are receiving what we deserve. Jesus is dying the death of the sinner. And that draws together the theme which the four Gospels display in so many ways, that Jesus goes in to feast with sinners during his lifetime, and people criticize him for that. Jesus allows unclean people to touch him, or he touches them, but instead of him becoming unclean, they become cleansed from their illness, whatever it may be. And now on the cross, he has gone out to die with the brigands. The fate of Israel as a whole, which Jesus had warned, if you persist in what you're doing, the Romans are going to come and destroy you and your temple. But Jesus goes ahead of them to take that fate upon himself. He says at one point, how often I wanted to gather you like a hen gathering her chicks under her wings when there's a fire in the farmyard, or maybe when there's a fox comes into the farmyard. The hen gathers the chicks and tries to protect them. The hen will die rather than the chicks being killed. And Jesus says, that's what I wanted to do. Jesus goes ahead of his people to take upon himself the weight of the fate that was in store for them, so that they will go free. And thereby he breaks the power and the entail of evil. Victory through substitution. If you want formulae, if you want a phrase to encapsulate it, I think that's what's going on. At every point in this story, the Gospels are echoing one passage after another in the Old Testament. One could spend a long time going through them, and Jesus, in fact, does precisely that. Towards the end of Luke's Gospel, he meets incognito two disciples on the road to Emmaus. He's been raised from the dead. They don't yet know that. They are downcast because they've been following him, and they thought he was the one to redeem Israel, but the Romans have executed him, so he can't have been, because we all know it's failed messiahs who end up getting crucified. And Jesus says, how foolish you are, how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and so enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. That was a Bible exposition and a half. If only we had all the footnotes. But actually, as we read Luke's Gospel and then on into Acts, I think Luke is telling us again and again which passages, which particular themes of Scripture Jesus was invoking and evoking at that time. And so we find all sorts of passages in the Old Testament which resonate with this. One of my favorites, though people don't often draw attention to this, is towards the end of the Joseph story, the end of the book of Genesis. Joseph is making himself known to his brothers who have come to Egypt to buy corn, but they at the moment don't realize it's him, but he's about to reveal himself. But he has played a trick on them and put them in the position where, if they wanted, they could let Benjamin become a slave, like they had sold Joseph himself into slavery before. But then Judah steps forward, Judah, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, and Judah says to Joseph, not realizing it is Joseph, "Look here, my father, he is an old man. If this young boy, anything bad happens to him, it will be the death of my father. I promised my father that I would go surety for him. So if you want to keep one of us as your slave, then keep me instead of Benjamin." And that idea of Judah standing in for Benjamin, I have a sense that maybe St. Paul, who came from the tribe of Benjamin, as he knew that story like the back of his hand, reflected on Jesus, who was from the tribe of Judah, and thought, here is the Messiah from the tribe of Judah, who loved me and gave himself for me, who stepped forward and said, I will take the blame, I will go to the cross, so that you, Saul of Tarsus, even though you've been a persecutor, etc., so that you can go free. Yes, he says, the Son of God loved me and gave himself for me. And that amazingly touching, intimate human scene of Joseph and Judah, and then, of course, that's when Joseph does reveal himself to his brothers. That, I think, resonates forward into the Old Testament. But there are so many other things. The Passover theme itself of God coming in judgment upon the land of Egypt, but rescuing his people, the Israelite people, under the blood of the Lamb and bringing them through the waters of the Red Sea and off to the Promised Land. Every aspect of that is picked up in some way or other in the story of Jesus going to the cross. And particularly then in the desert, when a sickness and plague strikes the people, and God commands Moses to take a piece of bronze and make it a model of a serpent, because the serpents have been biting the people, and put it on a pole. And anyone who looks at that pole will live despite the bite of the serpent. Jesus say in John 3:14, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that anyone who sees and believes in him would not perish but have eternal life. There's so many signs and symbols. It goes on through the sufferings of King David, the exile of David at the hands of Absalom, and then his being brought back. The suffering righteous ones in the Psalms, Psalm 22 and many others like it, which start off in darkness but then work through to redemption. We can see the suffering figure bearing the promises of God through into the light after all. Climactically in the stories of Israel's exile and restoration, and particularly in the great central section of Isaiah, chapters 40 to 55 of Isaiah, which are all about the return of Yahweh to Zion, but also all about the strange figure of Yahweh's servant, who seems from one point of view to be the Messiah, from another point of view to be the arm of Yahweh himself, the personal embodiment of Yahweh, but who ends up being despised and rejected and tortured and killed and wounded for our transgressions and bruised for our iniquities, as a result of which, that was Isaiah 53. Isaiah 54 is about the renewal of the covenant. Isaiah 55 is about the renewal of all creation and the invitation to all and sundry, just as in John chapter 12, so that anyone now can come in and can be part of God's people. So I imagine Jesus on the road to Emmaus explaining all this and much, much more to these disciples. And as they say, once they've recognized him, our hearts were burning within us on the road as he opened the scriptures to us and made it clear to us that the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth was not a terrible mistake on God's part or on Jesus' part. It was what had to happen. The paradox there, the irony there, is ultimately the same irony which takes the image this image of crucifixion, which was an image of the brute force and violence and arrogance of empire, and transforms it into the image of love, the symbol which says, the Son of God loved me and gave himself for me, so that within 20 years that change has happened. So that now what we find is God rescuing humans to be then in turn image bearers and people who take up the cross, because the victory which was won on the cross has to be implemented by the cross. Paul sees that, 1 Peter sees that, the book of Revelation sees that. This is how the Sermon on the Mount people are to be. They are to be loving, forgiving people, people who turn the other cheek, people who go the second mile, people who bring this incarnate love of God to the world. The crucifixion of Jesus is simultaneously the one moment when history turned its great corner and a new world was begun. And at the same time, it is the symbol which guides us as we follow Jesus, so that we can be people through whom that same healing, forgiving love of God, that Passover acting God, becomes known and loved in the wider world. The Bible is full of images expressing themes that run right through the whole narrative. We need to examine each of these images closely. We need to see how they all connect us to the larger story. We need to read the images. At the beginning of the Bible, in the story of creation in Genesis 1, it says that God puts into the world that he is making, plants that have seed which will enable them to reproduce and multiply. God says, let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with the seed in it. And it was so. And then the author can't get enough of the theme. He says the earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with the seed. And God saw that it was good. When Genesis stresses something like this, it's because it's important that the sort of creation that God is making is a creation which has the seeds of its own multiplicity within it. That's how God wants to work in the world. God gives to his world the principle of ongoing life. And it's the same when God commands the humans to be fruitful and multiply, and indeed the other animals to be fruitful and multiply, putting within the world creatures who have this capacity to multiply, to become abundant, to fill his world, to fill his project, his heaven plus earth creation. There's a principle of ongoing life which God has put into the world. So often in the modern Western world, we have imagined God or heaven a long way away and earth and humans down here somewhere, so that if God is going to do anything, it'll be because God just zaps the world in a quick one-off and then goes away again. That's the wrong model. That comes from maybe 18th century deism or Neo-Epicureanism. The world is a long way away. How is God going to do stuff? But Genesis gives an answer to that God has made the world in such a way as fresh things will happen from within. God is at work in the world, and the principle of the seed is one of the key ways in which that happens. Now, as this works out through the story of the Bible, it comes up in surprising ways, and often we today don't notice this because our translations don't necessarily alert us to it. But when God makes his covenant with Abraham in Genesis 15, he says, look up to heaven and count the stars if you can, and then he says, so shall your descendants be. But the word for descendants there is the same word as the word seed, zerak, in Hebrew, and in the Septuagint translation, the Greek, sperma. And so descendants in Genesis, or family sometimes, is also another translation that we find. In Genesis 22, after Abraham has been prepared to offer his own son Isaac as a sacrifice, God says, because you have done this, I will bless you and make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven. But the word for offspring is the same word, seed. And then Genesis 22:18, By your offspring, your seed, shall all the nations of the earth gain blessing for themselves, because you have obeyed my voice. So what we find in Genesis 15 and 22 is that God is doing the new creation which seemed to have been put into abeyance by human sin. God calls Abraham and his family to undo the sin of Adam and its consequences. That's one of the fundamental principles of reading the Old Testament and actually on into the New as it retrieves the stories of both Adam and Abraham. So that Abraham's family is to be the people of the seed, the descendants, the ones through whose ongoing family life God will do the new thing, which is going to address the problem of Adam, and through addressing the problem of Adam, will address the problem of all creation. The promises to Abraham then come into a new sort of focus with the call of David. King David seems an unlikely choice to begin with. He was unlikely when Samuel came to Jesse's house in Bethlehem looking for the one who was to be the Lord's anointed after Saul had proved by his disobedience that he was unfit to be king. And David happened to be out in the fields keeping sheep, but Samuel says, bring him in, and then he anoints him as the future, the once and coming king. And so David becomes king. But when David is settled and has established himself in his kingdom, David wants to build a house for the Lord. He wants to build a permanent dwelling place for God. This ties in, of course, with the whole theme of the temple and new creation, which we've already talked about. But in 2 Samuel 7, Nathan the prophet comes to David and says, well, that wasn't a bad idea that you should build a house for the Lord, but actually you're the wrong person to do that. You've got too much blood on your hands. You've been too much a man of violence. I'm going to raise up your seed after you, who will sit on your throne. This is going to be Solomon, and he will build me a house, but I will be his father, and he will be my son. And most translations don't say, I will raise up your seed, because that's not how we talk about sons or descendants in much contemporary English. But that's the phrase, and it's picked up in the New Testament explicitly, that Jesus comes of the seed of David according to the flesh. Romans 1:3, Paul's crucial early summary in Romans of the gospel message of Jesus, son of David, son of God, Lord of the world. And so when God says through the prophet Nathan to David, I will raise up your seed, the early Christians looked at that passage and they saw in it a prophecy not just of a line of descendants, but of resurrection. I don't think anyone before Jesus had read that text in that way, 2 Samuel 7 verse 12. But once Jesus had been raised from the dead, the Jesus who they had hoped was going to be the Davidic Messiah, then that text, as it were, sprang to new life. I will resurrect your seed. And they hail Jesus as the true seed of David. But along with the Davidic extension, as it were, of the Abrahamic promise, goes the worldwide extension, because in Psalm 2, the psalmist has God saying to David, ask of me and I will give you the nations for your inheritance, the uttermost parts of the earth for your possession. He's using Abrahamic language, which was originally about the promised land and about Abraham's seed dwelling in the promised land, to describe David's domain, that is the coming ultimate messianic kingdom of the Lord's anointed, as being the whole wide world. What is said of Abraham and the land is said of David and the world. And so we find promises about the seed. We find in Isaiah 40 and 55, the grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever. That's Isaiah 40, picked up at the end of the great poem in Isaiah 55. That as the rain and the snow come down from heaven and don't return but water the earth, so shall my word be that goes forth from my mouth. It will accomplish my purpose. And he says, because I am the God who gives seed to the sower and bread to the eater. And I am the one who will make this land flourish and abound. It will multiply. It will be abundant again. This is the promise of new creation through the seed, which is the word. So shall my word be. It will do this work. And that's precisely what Jesus picks up in his parables. Before we get there, though, we see in the exilic and post-exilic literature of ancient Israel this sense that the remnant of the Judeans who return from Babylon to Judea, they are seen as the holy seed. That's how they would read Isaiah 6:13. When the tree has been cut down and burned, then the holy seed will be its stump, the remnant. But the holy seed themselves are corrupt, according to the prayer in Ezra chapter 9. The holy seed have gone astray. They have corrupted themselves. Even though you brought us back from exile, we are still in a mess. But they're using this word seed as it were almost as a carrier of the promise. We are Abraham's seed. Sometime you will send us David's true seed. So please, they pray, please do it. Please forgive us. Please take forward your purposes. And the early church, telling the story of Jesus, tells the story of Jesus as the seed of Abraham, the seed of David, the one who was to come. And so, as I said, Jesus announces the kingdom. And the very first parable framed as such in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is the parable of the sower who goes about sowing seed. And the seed is the word. These are the echoes of Isaiah, and Isaiah himself echoing all the way back to Genesis. This, in other words, is new creation. Of course, it's a puzzle because Jesus' challenge is that's what God is doing right here and now. God is sowing his people again. God is doing the new covenant, the new creation that he always promised. But much of that seed seems to be going to waste. People don't want it. They don't want Jesus' message. They hear and they hear, but they don't understand. They don't get it. They turn away. And so the promise of the seed is that there will be great fruitfulness, great multiplication, great abundance. And Jesus symbolizes that in his feeding miracles, when he feeds large crowds with what start off as just tiny little scraps of food. These are not like the temptation when Jesus was tempted to turn stones into bread. No, these are Jesus taking bread and making more of it. As C.S. Lewis says in his book Miracles, this has the messianic style about it. This is God doing creation, taking what is there already and multiplying it and making it be more fruitful and so on. And so we find then in Paul's theology, Jesus as the true seed, but because Jesus is the Messiah, the seed of David, then all those who are in him become the seed which is the true remnant, which is now going to multiply and grow. It won't be a little remnant getting whittled down to nothing. It'll be a new remnant starting off the whole new worldwide proposal. Because in Galatians chapter 3, Paul uses this image of the seed in exactly this way, that God's purpose when he called Abraham was to give him a single seed, but it was a seed which would be a family consisting of Jews and Gentiles alike. So Galatians 3:29 says, if you are the Messiahs, if you belong to Jesus the Messiah, then you are Abraham's seed, heirs according to promise. And again, the translations don't always bring that out. We find the same in Romans 4, and Paul develops it elsewhere. So the idea of the seed starting off apparently innocently without much resonance in Genesis 1 is in fact a major carrier of the themes of creation and new creation, and a major pointer to the fact that the Creator God has done the new creation in Jesus and is continuing to do it, blessing and multiplying and giving abundance wherever the gospel reaches. The Bible is full of images expressing themes that run right through the whole narrative. We need to examine each of these images closely. We need to see how they all connect us to the larger story. We need to read the images. The well-known opening of John's Gospel, "In the beginning was the Word," doesn't just stop with the word, it moves on quickly to light, and it makes the theme of light quite central to what is going to be coming up in the rest of the text. Of course, as with other things in the prologue, John doesn't do this obviously using the same idea in chapter after chapter after chapter, but what he says here in the prologue tells us to wait for one of the crucial moments in the gospel when Jesus will be revealed as the light of the world. This is how the prologue puts it. You know the opening bit. "In the beginning was the Word was close beside God, and the Word was God. In the beginning he was close beside God. All things came into existence through him. Not one thing that exists came into existence without him." Then, verse 4, "Life was in him, and this life was the light of the human race. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it." Already we have a paradox, it seems. This is God, the Creator, coming into his world, shining with light, but there is darkness as well. And though the darkness doesn't overcome it, the fact that he says that indicates that the darkness seems to be trying to overcome it. John's Gospel as a battle between the light and the dark? Well, in a sense, yes. And then he goes on. He talks about John the Baptist, sent from God. He came, verse 7, as evidence, to give evidence about the light, so that everyone might believe. He was not himself the light, but he came to give evidence about the light. John repeats it again and again. Verse 8, verse 9, "The true light which gives light to every human being was coming into the world." And then he leaves the theme and goes on and develops other ideas. But you see how he is so concerned to say what matters about Jesus is that he is shining God's light into the darkness of the world. And of course, like almost everything else in John's prologue to his gospel, this is a direct echo of Genesis. Genesis chapter 1, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. It's the first thing that happens right at the beginning of creation. And John wants to say, this is how you must see, this is the first way of interpreting Jesus right at the beginning of the gospel. And so from there on, we have this sense that all the prophecies about light, all the symbols of light in the Old Testament are going to land in a new way and do a new thing in and through the story that John is going to be telling. In the book of Exodus, when great darkness comes upon the people of Egypt, as God is bringing the plagues in Egypt to a climax, the rest of Egypt is in darkness at one point, but the people of Israel have light, and it's not long after that that God rescues them at Passover time. That's Exodus chapter 10. And this theme of light then continues through the Old Testament. The psalm says, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom then shall I fear?" I know that text well because it's the motto of my university, and it's on the ceiling in all the crests of the ceiling of the rooms where we used to do the exams, and I used to look back and think, Dominus illuminatio mea, the Lord is my light, a wonderful psalm text from Psalm 27, but so many other passages as well in the Old Testament. But then coming forward into John's Gospel again, Jesus is the light of the world. But it's paradoxical, because in chapter 8, verse 12, Jesus says, "I am the light of the world, and people who follow me won't go around in the dark. They'll have the light of life." You'll be living in the light, and people don't believe him. They reject him. They say, "You're just talking about yourself and your evidence is invalid." And Jesus argues with them and says that the Father is bearing witness to him. And then in the next chapter, John 9, Jesus heals a man born blind. And John sees this as one of the great symbols of what the gospel is all about, that all around are people who can't see, and Jesus is opening eyes. And that opening of people's blind eyes is like itself an act of new creation. When Jesus gets basically some mud, he spits on the ground and makes some mud out of his spittle and the dust of the earth, and he spreads the mud on the man's eyes and tells him to go away and wash. It's like God creating human beings from the dust of the earth and breathing into their nostrils the breath of life. This man now can see, but for John he is also a symbol of new creation. And so then the rest of John 9 is all about light and darkness. And it may well be that John is placing this incident at the time of the Feast of Tabernacles in Jerusalem, which, among other things, was a festival of lights, like some other festivals that the Judean people had. But if we think about light in relation to the Gospels, then it's not difficult to see one of the places where this all rushes together. Because though John's Gospel doesn't have a description of the Transfiguration, it is as though the Transfiguration scene from Matthew, Mark and Luke is transposed by John into the whole of his Gospel, so that the theme of light, of Jesus as revealing the Father's light, suffuses all of John's Gospel. But in the Transfiguration itself, for a brief moment, the eyes of the disciples are opened and they can see who Jesus really is and what Jesus really is. And there he is talking with Moses and Elijah, as with the two on the road to Emmaus, interpreting himself in terms of the law and the prophets, the scriptures bearing witness to him, and particularly the scriptures pointing to Jesus as the light of the world. So the whole story of Jesus as light then gives birth to Jesus' vocation to his followers that they should be people of light. Jesus says in Matthew 5, at the heart of the introduction to the Sermon on the Mount, "You are the light of the world, so don't go putting a bucket over the top of the light to stop the light shining." What is he saying? He is saying to his contemporaries, to the people in Judea and Galilee who were following him, you are now called to be for the world what Israel was always supposed to be for the world, the light-bringing people. But watch out, because if you try to keep the light for yourself, then you know what will happen. It becomes very bright for a while, and then the light goes out. I've often used the image of a lighthouse. I grew up not too far from the northeast shore of England, and there were lighthouses that you could see from miles away. And if you go and visit those lighthouses, they have, of course, windows around the light to let the light out. But Jesus is warning against the danger of putting mirrors around the light, because then you can flatter yourselves that of course you're people of light, because it's all very bright in here, but you're supposed to be shining the light out there into the world. Jesus' vocation to be kingdom people is the vocation to be the light of the world. So to live as individuals, but more particularly as a community, the followers of Jesus, the church if you like, to be the people through whom the light will resonate out into the world. Paul in particular picks up this theme several times when he's talking about his own ministry. One of Paul's favourite texts is from Isaiah 49, where the servant of the Lord is told, "It's too little a thing that you should be my servant in order to restore the tribes of Israel. I will make you a light to the Gentiles, so that my glory may extend to the end of the world." Paul refers to that passage 4 or 5 times from Isaiah 49 in his writings. And when he's summarizing his own public career, when he's giving an account of it in the book of Acts to the people who are in effect sitting in judgment on him, the Roman governor Festus and King Herod Agrippa II, when he's talking about how he was called by Jesus on the road to Damascus. Jesus said to him, you are going to be sent to the nations so that you can open their eyes to enable them to turn from darkness to light. The people of Israel were to be the people of light. That light has now been focused on Jesus, and Paul is commissioned to be an agent of that light. And then at the end of his lecture, if that's what it is, to King Agrippa and to Festus, he says, "This is what the prophets and Moses said would happen, that the Messiah would suffer, that he would be the first to rise from the dead," this is Acts 26, verse 23, "and that he would proclaim light to the people and to the nations." That light which lightens everyone that comes into the world. We all have a glimpse of it, but the darkness is struggling to overcome it. And the gospel light is to shine out, to shine into the places where there is at present darkness, so that people can see the light and turn and come to the light and become for themselves people of light. And that theme, which stretches all the way back to Genesis, stretches all the way on to the book of Revelation, where the light in the city, which is the new heavens and the new earth put together, the light is God himself and the Lamb, which is why at last they don't need the sun and the moon anymore, because the light has come to dwell with them in perpetuity. The Bible is full of images expressing themes that run right through the whole narrative. We need to examine each of these images closely. We need to see how they all connect us to the larger story. We need to read the images. In the ancient world, it would sometimes happen that the king or ruler of some great country would win a victory over another country and would make that country subservient to himself and would set up a binding agreement. I am doing this for you now, and you're going to do this for me. Or they might simply enter into some sort of a political agreement, but again and again there would be an agreement as to how the two of them would work together. That's putting it very broadly, and it would need a lot more scholarly bells and whistles if I were to spell it out fully. But the point is that in the Old Testament, we see again and again the Bible speaking about the covenant that God makes with certain people. The covenant is then a binding agreement, an agreement which God makes, which binds God, who is then going to be faithful to that covenant, and certainly binds the people with whom God is making that covenant. And this becomes a theme, a kind of a running topic, which goes on, because it isn't just nations that form covenants, it's individual people, of which the best known form of covenant is marriage itself. And indeed, as we'll see in a minute, marriage is one of the images which is used in the Old Testament for the binding agreement between God and Israel. And then that turns around in the New Testament to become the marriage of the Messiah and his bride, as all the way to the end of the book of Revelation. So where do we first meet this idea of covenant? Some people think in terms of God making a covenant with Adam or with Adam and Eve. Well, God certainly gives Adam and Eve instructions, be fruitful and multiply and look after the garden and so on. Genesis doesn't actually call that a covenant, but in the light of later things that happen, we can cautiously refer to Adam and Eve as being in covenant with God, which they then break, and then God has to expel them from Eden and so on. I'm always a bit wary of that, because some people have tried to make too much of a supposed covenant with Adam and then deduce certain things from it. Let's not go there. Let's stick with where the Bible actually takes us, where the first covenant that we find is the covenant with Noah, and through Noah with all of creation. Because, as I said in an earlier section, when after Adam and Eve's time, the land was full, the earth was full of people who were rebelling against God and living by violence and were committing all kinds of wickedness. And the flood looks as though it's God's way of saying, this is what really ought to happen if I was being strictly just. everything, all humans, everybody would be obliterated. But God is gracious, and his original purpose in creation is not going to be thwarted. So he calls Noah and his family, as it were, to restart the project, to be the beginning of a new wave for the human family on the face of the earth. And to show that they are not going to be destroyed by a flood, God puts his bow in the clouds like a warrior hanging up his bow, and so that the rainbow, the bow which appears in the clouds after rain, becomes a symbol in Genesis chapter 9 of the covenant that God makes with Noah and with all of creation. And it's a way of saying, I will be faithful to the whole of my creation. I will not let it be destroyed. And so everything that happens subsequently is a way of God saying, and this is how my faithfulness is going to work out. What is God going to do? Well, the next covenant that we meet is God's covenant with Abraham in Genesis chapter 15, which turns into God's covenant with Abraham because he's renamed. Abraham means I'm the father of many nations in Genesis 17, and then it's renewed again in Genesis 22. And in Genesis 15, it's a very dark and solemn thing. But the chapter begins with Abraham, who has been promised a land and a family, saying to God, excuse me, what's going to happen to this promise? Because I don't have a child, and someone else is going to inherit all that is mine. And God saying, actually, no. I am going to give you not just one child, but an uncountable inheritance, like the stars in the sky. And it says, Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. It's a very oblique phrase. It's not a phrase we would use today unless we were explicitly echoing a passage like that in the Bible. But as we see it working out, what it means is that God makes a covenant with Abraham, and then God is going to be faithful to that covenant, and Abraham becomes the one who is the covenant partner, the one who is to be righteous in God's sight, not just morally righteous, though that's of course part of the deal, but the one who is himself to be faithful to the covenant, and God will work through him. And the way that covenant is established is a strange old ritual which looks as if it belongs in the world of the ancient Near East, where they took sacrificial animals and killed them and cut them in two pieces and then passed between the broken pieces of the bodies of the animals as a way of saying, if I am not faithful to this, then may I be pulled apart like these animals. Only in the case of the covenant with Abraham in Genesis 15, it is God himself who passes through between the pieces of the animals as a way of saying God is going to be faithful to this covenant. And Genesis 15 comes all the way through into the New Testament. And in Galatians 3 and Romans 4, Paul draws on it, and he clearly knows the whole passage and has meditated on it as he sees the promise that God made to Abraham, that God would give him a family consisting of many nations and make him the father of a multitude of peoples, not just one family, but of people from every nation and tribe and tongue. God, says Paul, was faithful and is faithful to that promise. But as the story of Abraham and his family goes forward with the covenant renewed through the badge of circumcision in Genesis 17 and then renewed again in 22 after Abraham has been commanded to sacrifice his son, and then God rescues him at the last minute, the story moves forward to the children of Israel in Egypt, and then God making a covenant with them at the time when he brings them out of Egypt and takes them to Mount Sinai. And God gives them the Torah, and the Torah, the law, beginning with the Ten Commandments, but really containing the whole law. The law is the charter of the covenant, that if you are to be God's covenant people, this is what it's going to look like. This is how you are to live as covenant people. And when Moses sprinkles the blood of the covenant upon them in Exodus 24, this is a way of saying you are now sanctified as the people in whose midst God is going to come and dwell. And that covenant remains there behind everything that happens subsequently in the Old Testament. But then the next time we meet covenant explicitly, it's with David. With David in 2 Samuel 7, when God promises him that in his seed there will be the chance to build the temple at last, so that God will come and dwell permanently in the midst of his people. And that God promises David not just that he will have one son who will build the temple, but that he will have an ongoing royal house forever. And this is picked up in the book of the Psalms, where in Psalm 89, the psalmist envisages God saying, I have made a covenant with David. His seed will I establish forever, and his throne will be before me to all generations. But then Psalm 89 is one of those psalms which changes in the middle. And having celebrated the covenant with David, the second half of the psalm says, but now it's all gone wrong. Now you have abandoned the covenant with your servant. You've cast it behind your back. You're not paying any attention because the present Davidic king is being overthrown. Lord, where are your steadfast love and mercy? What's happened to them? And so the covenant appears to be broken, and the psalmist is appealing to God on the basis of the unbreakable covenant which he made with David. But that's partly, of course, because, as we see in the book of Hosea, Israel was supposed to be Yahweh's bride. The book of Hosea looks back to the time when God brought Israel into the wilderness like a young man bringing his bride in order to woo her and make her his own, and looks back to the covenant that God made on Sinai as a marriage covenant. And Hosea is saying, but Israel has been unfaithful, and this is what happens as a result. It's going to be exile and all that follows from that. And so the exile is seen as this terrible moment, like a great divorce, when God appears to have broken off the covenant with Abraham, with David, with Israel as a whole. But in the promises of renewal in Isaiah, in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, we get the promise of the new covenant. The phrase new covenant occurs particularly in Jeremiah 31. God says, I will make a new covenant, not like the old covenant because they broke that one. But this time I'm going to put my law in their hearts, and they will be able to obey me from the heart, and I will be merciful to them, and I will remember their sin no more. And in Isaiah 54, verse 10, God says, I will now make with you the covenant of peace. That's a phrase that comes elsewhere, Ezekiel 34 and other places as well. Because of the work of the servant in Isaiah 52 and 53, God will renew the covenant, and this time it will be a covenant of peace. And as a result, chapter 55 of Isaiah says, I will make with anyone who is thirsty and comes to me to drink, I will make with them the covenant that I made with David. This is, as it were, the democratization of the Davidic promises and covenant, that anyone now who wants to benefit from Yahweh's generous presence and love and fruitful, fruit-bearing gifts, anyone can come and God will establish the covenant with them. And that's really the picture which is then picked up in the New Testament. So that though Jesus doesn't use the word covenant very often, he doesn't use it because it's kind of everywhere assumed. When he preaches the Sermon on the Mount, and when he teaches in parables, it's all about what is God doing with Israel? How is God being faithful to the covenant? And the answer is, this is what it looks like when God's covenant faithfulness is unveiled. It looks like this young Jewish prophet going around celebrating the kingdom with all the wrong people, healing people, teaching wisely but challengingly about the seed growing secretly and all the rest of it, telling stories about a man who had two sons and one of them went off and one of them didn't, and so on and so on. All these things are ways of saying this is the story of Israel and how God is working that out. But it's not going to happen the way that you might have liked it to. God has new things to do, and that all comes to a head when Jesus takes his close followers, and on the night when he's going to be betrayed, he breaks bread with them and he says, this is now the new covenant. and pours out the wine. This cup is the new covenant in my blood, shed for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. Drawing in those great themes from the book of Exodus, from Jeremiah, all the way back to Abraham, and perhaps also with echoes of Adam in behind. And so the New Testament builds out from that point to the new covenant promise in 2 Corinthians 3, to the whole letter to the Hebrews, which is all about how God's new covenant now looks like this, focused on Jesus and reaching out to all believers, and to Paul's expositions of the covenant theology in Romans 4 and Galatians 3 and so on. And again we see two things going on which many have found it difficult to hold together. On the one hand, covenant is all about God being faithful to his promises and never looking back and so on and so on. But on the other hand, it's all about God doing something new, God breaking into history and doing something completely unexpected. And it's only in retrospect, like on the road to Emmaus, and like in much of what Paul says, that we look back and we see what has happened in Jesus and his death and resurrection and his ascension as Lord and his gift of the Spirit. This is, in fact, what God's covenant faithfulness looked like, even though we hadn't seen it coming. And so we see the New Testament church going out as God's covenant partners, going out into the world to be a family of believers who are in covenant with one another, in covenant of unity and peace and siblinghood with one another, though that's been so hard to maintain. But within that, the families of the church, individual households being in covenant with one another and with the church, to be within the church and for the world, the sign of God's faithfulness, faithfulness to creation, faithfulness to covenant, faithfulness which will result in the end, in the new heavens and the new earth, when the whole story from Genesis all the way through will finally come to completion. The sign over it will be, God was faithful, God is faithful, God has been and always will be faithful. That's covenant theology. The Bible is full of images expressing themes that run right through the whole narrative. We need to examine each of these images closely. We need to see how they all connect us to the larger story. We need to read the images. There's a strange moment in Mark's Gospel, chapter 8, when Jesus warns his disciples against the leaven of the Pharisees and Herod. Now, if I were just to read that out cold in church, most of the people listening would say, what on earth is he talking about? And indeed the disciples, I think, wondered what on earth Jesus was talking about, though for them they knew the significance of leaven, because ever since the Jewish Passover, way back when God rescued Israel from Egypt, the Passover meal was marked by the eating of unleavened bread. They had to clear out leaven because the bread had to be created quickly so that they could then leave Egypt in a hurry. And so thereafter, leaven became a symbol of something which dilutes the basic thing, which, makes the bread a different sort of thing, but if you use leaven as a metaphor thereafter, it's a way of saying, here is the true thing, and if you add leaven, you're kind of spoiling it somehow. So the disciples are initially puzzled because they say he's talking about bread, but we forgot to bring any bread. And Jesus says, no, that's not the point, and it wouldn't matter anyway, because shortly before then, Jesus has multiplied loaves and fishes, and he's done it twice, actually. According to Mark chapter 6 and 8, this is something that happens again, that the crowds are hungry and Jesus feeds them, having started with very small helpings and then multiplying it so that everyone can eat. So what is Jesus talking about? He is warning that the Pharisees and the Herodians, that is, the people who are supporting Herod Antipas in his royal claims, they are diluting the kingdom message. Jesus is using bread as an image for the kingdom, that the kingdom which Jesus is inaugurating, which is God's sovereign saving rule on earth as in heaven, can be watered down, if you like, or leavened, to use the Jewish metaphor, metaphor, both by the Pharisees, who think that the kingdom will come when everyone just keeps the Torah perfectly, and by the followers of Herod, who think that the kingdom will come when we all acknowledge that Herod is in fact the true king of the Jews. And Jesus says, no, neither of them get it. We need the real unleavened bread of the kingdom. And that goes almost straight on from there in Mark's Gospel to when Jesus takes his disciples away up north to Caesarea Philippi and says, who are people saying that I am? And they say, well, some say Elijah or one of the prophets or somebody like that. Who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you're the Messiah. And then Jesus starts to explain to them that he is going to have to go up to Jerusalem and suffer and be killed, and on the third day be raised. Well, the Pharisees and the Herodians never imagined that the kingdom of God would come like that. Jesus is warning them against diluted versions of the kingdom and instead pointing them to the true meaning of the kingdom, that he, Jesus, is the king who is coming. They're right to recognize him as such, even though he doesn't look much like people thought a Messiah would. But his road to messianic victory and glory is going to be the deeply paradoxical one of going the route of suffering and death. And Jesus refers to that, if you like, as the bread of the kingdom. And we find the same thing going on in John chapter 6, which is a much more elongated version of the discussion that Jesus has with the crowds after he has fed them in the desert with the bread. That's at the beginning of John chapter 6. And interestingly, immediately after that's happened, the crowds want to come and make him king, and Jesus withdraws to the mountain. But when he then meets them again and they start asking questions, it's all about, well, who do you think you are? And didn't Moses give us bread from heaven? Alluding back to Exodus chapter 16, where God gave manna from heaven so that the children of Israel could eat bread in the wilderness, a strange thing which went on throughout their wilderness wanderings, so that Jesus is saying then, no, it's not Moses who gives you the real bread. The real bread is that which I will give you. And then he moves on, just as he does in Mark 8. The bread which I will give is my flesh for the life of the world. So that bread becomes an image not just for the kingdom itself, but for Jesus himself and all that he is going to do. The bread of God is the one who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. It's like the manna, only in human form, John 6:33. The early church was bound to hear that promise in terms of the Eucharist, in terms of the bread and the wine which spoke so powerfully and still speak so powerfully of God's outpoured love in the death and resurrection of Jesus. The idea of God feeding us with himself, with his own very self. In paganism, when they had temples and offered sacrifices and so on, again and again, the image was of a hungry God who needs to be fed by human beings. And God says already in one of the Psalms, if I was hungry, I wouldn't actually tell you, because I own the whole of creation. All the animals on the hills belong to me, so it wouldn't be a big deal. I wouldn't come knocking on your door to feed me. And so Israel basically knew that, but Jesus transposes this into a new key, that now the real bread is the one who comes down from heaven to give life to the world. Once again, the same thing we've seen elsewhere, that humans naturally think that our task is to find our way up to God, maybe offering him gifts on the way, whereas the whole Bible story is about God wanting to come and dwell with his people and to feed them with his own life and love. One of the images which celebrates that truth in the Old Testament is that in the tabernacle in the wilderness, when the priests were doing their regular duties, they would set aside 2 loaves on a special table to be the bread of the presence. It's sometimes translated in the older versions as the showbread, which is a way of saying we don't really know what it means, but it's on display there. But actually the Hebrew word there means bread of the face, that the face of God, the presence of God is somehow symbolized by these loaves being there. And it seems to me that when Jesus is talking about giving his flesh for the life of the world, and when then he says with the bread, "This is my body given for you, do this in remembrance of me," and when he talks about people feeding on him and drinking his blood, this is functioning the same way as the showbread, granted all the differences that there are between the tabernacle in the wilderness and the ongoing life of Jesus' followers in the church. That the bread of the Eucharist, of the Lord's Supper, this is the visible, tangible, edible reminder of, conveyor of, the very presence of Jesus himself. This is the bread of the face, the bread of the presence. One of the Eucharistic hymns which in my church we often sing, "Here, O my Lord, I see thee face to face. Here faith would touch and handle things unseen." That's all about the bread, which is one of the most ordinary things that humans make to eat, but now is taken up by God to be the vehicle of the most extraordinary thing you can imagine, namely the very presence of God himself, given to us in the breaking of the bread. The Bible is full of images expressing themes that run right through the whole narrative. We need to examine each of these images closely. We need to see how they all connect us to the larger story. We need to read the images. Jesus in Matthew 11 is greeted by some people who have come to him from John the Baptist. John the Baptist is in prison because he had been telling the crowds that Herod Antipas couldn't be the real Messiah because he'd taken his brother's wife. No Messiah would ever do such a thing. So Herod Antipas was cross with John, put him in prison, and as we know, eventually had him beheaded. But when John was in prison, he heard what Jesus was doing, that he was going about healing people and doing stuff like that, which didn't quite fit the picture which John the Baptist had had of Jesus before. Because when John was preaching publicly at the time when he was baptizing people down by the Jordan, he said to people that somebody was coming after him who was more powerful than he was, who would baptize you with the Holy Spirit and with fire. What did he mean? Well, he certainly didn't mean somebody going around healing lepers and lame people and people who couldn't see and so on. He meant something much more dramatic. And some people have wondered whether John the Baptist thought that he was preparing the way for Elijah to come, and that Jesus, as it were, returned the compliment. And Jesus says to the crowds, actually, John the Baptist is Elijah who is to come, because the one who comes after Elijah is Yahweh himself, the God of Israel. And yes, he will bring fire, though not maybe in the form that you think of. So who was Elijah, and what was that fire all about? When we think of fire in the Old Testament, Elijah is one of the obvious places to go, because at one point, when Elijah is being faced with the Israel in rebellion, wherever Elijah goes, people are opposed to him, and he calls down fire from heaven to consume them. And on another occasion, in 1 Kings 18, when there is a great contest between Elijah as a solo figure on behalf of Yahweh and all the people who were now the prophets of Baal, who was the pagan god that many Israelites had come to worship in the time of King Ahab. They have a great contest, and Elijah sets it up that we're going to build an altar and we're going to pray for fire to come down from heaven to consume the sacrifice. And the priests of Baal do this. They build an altar, they put a sacrifice on it, and they pray for Baal to send the fire, and nothing happens. And then Elijah rebuilds the altar of the Lord, which had been thrown down, puts the sacrifice on it, and just to make clear that this is the most extraordinary thing, pours water into a trench all the way round, and then prays for fire, and the fire falls and burns up the sacrifice and licks up the water, and the people realize that Yahweh is in fact the God who answers by fire. Well, yes, but not quite, because in the next sequence in 1 Kings 19, Elijah is under threat from Ahab's wife Jezebel, and he gets scared and runs away. And he goes all the way to the mountain of God, to Horeb or Mount Sinai, and there God reveals himself to him, and he hears a great rushing wind, and he sees an almighty fire, and there's an earthquake, but the Lord isn't in any of them. And then there's something just like the sound of sheer silence, and he realizes that God is answering him in a different way, that fire isn't enough, that the drama and the shouting isn't enough, that now there is something new to do, and he has to go back and continue his ministry in a very different mode. Although at the end, when it's time for Elijah to go, he is taken up to heaven by horses and chariots of fire, according to 2 Kings. So Elijah is the man of fire, and I think often when people refer to Elijah in the New Testament, they're thinking of fire. And that theme of fire comes again and again in the Old Testament, particularly the fire of judgment. But it's a fire of judgment which refines. Malachi 3 says, when God finally comes, he will be like a refiner's fire, and he will sit and purify the sons of Levi, so that they may offer to the Lord an offering in righteousness. The fire will consume everything that is not godly, that is not worthy, so that that which is godly and worthy will shine out like precious metal that has been refined in the fire, so that gold or silver or whatever it is can be more truly its real self. And when Jeremiah 23 says that God's word is like fire or like a hammer that breaks the rock in pieces, we have this sense again of God not merely offering suggestions, not merely offering a comment on what's going on, but God speaking and something like fire rushing through a community to purge away all that is evil. And that picture comes again and again in the New Testament as well. Our God, says Hebrews chapter 12, is a consuming fire, and that's meant as an appropriate warning, not a kind of an angry fire as though God is just petulant and peeved and so he's going to lash out, but because God loves his good creation, because God loves the people who have put their trust in him, he wants the very best for them, and so he must purge away and burn away everything that is less than the best. And this is, of course, what's going on when the Spirit falls on the disciples in Acts chapter 2, with tongues of fire resting upon each of them individually. That great scene in Acts 2, the scene of Pentecost, is very like what we find in Exodus 40, when the divine presence comes in shining splendor to live in the tabernacle. Now with a rushing mighty wind, the tongues of fire rest on the disciples, and they find they are able to witness to God and his mighty deeds in Jesus in the many languages of all the people who have gathered in Jerusalem at the time. So we do have the wind and we do have the fire. It's as though Elijah is come again. This is what actually John the Baptist had been referring to without realizing it when he talked about the coming one baptizing people with the Holy Spirit and with fire. That then becomes part of the Christian vocation, and a dangerous vocation it is. When you invoke the wind and the fire, the wind is going to disturb everything in the house, if you like, and the fire is going to burn away everything that is not worthy of God. That is, by definition, an uncomfortable and painful process. And sometimes we can see that as an ultimate future thing. Paul in 1 Corinthians 3 talks about the fire of judgment, the fire which will consume all that is not right in somebody's ministry. He talks about people building on the foundation, which is the Messiah, and some people are building with gold and silver and precious stones, and other people are building with wood and hay and stubble. Well, when the fire sweeps through, the wood and the hay and the stubble are going to be burned up, but the gold and the silver and the precious stones, just as Malachi chapter 3 had said, will be refined to shine more brightly, to be more truly what they really are. So when we talk about the final judgment of fire, which comes, of course, in Revelation, this is a way of God purging out of his good creation all that has corrupted and defaced it. It's been so easy, particularly in the wake of the long Middle Ages in the Western Church, to think of God just being angry and punishing people for casually breaking commands which were arbitrary in the first place. That's not what God's judgment is about. God's judgment is based on the goodness of creation and God's faithfulness to that good creation, so that he cannot allow that which corrupts and corrodes and defaces and destroys his creation, and especially that which defaces and destroys his image-bearing human creatures. He cannot allow that to stay in his new world. And so the fire must burn it up. And that's the picture we get towards the end of Revelation. Fire not as an independent element then, but as God's agent to burn away all that is not of the new creation. In purification or in destruction, it's got to be dealt with. And so we find in the famous passage, a difficult passage though, in 2 Peter chapter 3, rather like in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, where the Petrine epistle talks about the coming fire. And because there's a difficulty in the Greek text there, some very odd words, and different manuscripts have different readings at that point, which is quite unusual really for a major theme. But there it is. And so some older translations made it look as though God was going to burn up absolutely everything and start again from scratch. Now, the rest of the New Testament seems to indicate that the new creation which God will make will not be a new creation out of nothing, but a new creation out of the old creation, so that most people today prefer the Greek words which actually say that when the fire has done its work, then the reality of God's world, the truth of it, will be uncovered, will be displayed, will be disclosed, and that will be transformed by God into the new heavens and new earth which he has long promised. Now, of course, as the early fathers knew when they were arguing about how God is going to raise the dead, they already had suffered martyrdom, some of them from being burnt at the stake by pagans who had then burned their bodies and bones and thrown them into the river, so that then we'll see what will happen to your resurrection. But teachers like Irenaeus and Cyprian and Tertullian at the end of the 2nd century and the beginning of the 3rd century made it clear that actually that doesn't fox God, that doesn't put God in a bind. God made all that is, and God can easily do whatever he wants to do to make the new creation out of even the ruin of the old. So that one way or another, we shouldn't be worried about that 2 Peter 3 passage. It's an interesting and important little wrinkle in the surface of the text there. But basically the point is this: God's fire is good because it is judging all that needs to be judged, dealing with all that needs to be dealt with, so that God's good purpose for his new creation will shine out the more splendidly. And that points forward to our next segment.